So yeah, so situating, the case, the situation. It's not the first flotilla to try to break the Gaza blockade. The first one was, of course, famously the Mavi Marmara, who was composed of like several ships sailing from Turkey. They tried to break the blockade, and then they were, um, intervened by Israeli military forces. I think it was military forces, or maybe like special forces. Oh, hey, Hoth too. Thanks for following. And so. Um, People died. I don't remember exactly how many people died and how many people were injured, but it was like a very violent ordeal. So the risk of repeat is real. So it is pretty ballsy of Greta Thunberg to like be in that flotilla. It is not without risk. I guess the reason why she is there is to make it more high profile. It's not the same to kill a bunch of humanitarian activists from Turkey than killing Greta frickin' Thunberg. So that's pretty brave of her. So kudos to her for like, I guess, putting her body in the line. Um, and yeah, so a few things have changed from the first, the Mavi Marmara 2010 attempt. In that, so back in the day of the Mavi Marmara, the main, I guess, discussion was that there were two competing reports. One by a commission, set up by the Secretary General, and one by the Human Rights Council, which I actually have in the screen here. Let's see if I can put it in the screen. Uh, yeah, okay, hold on a second. This is all weird. Oh, there you go. That's better. So, report of the International Fact-Finding Mission to investigate humanitarian violations of international law, including IHL and human rights law, resulting from the Israeli attacks on the flotilla of ships carrying humanitarian assistance. This is relatively a famous report, but the problem is that there were two reports. There was this one, which I think is the more internationally recognized report, done by human rights experts, um, and in a fact-finding mission for the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And then there was also, I don't have the link here, but there was also a Secretary General report, um, which was basically, was it a former New Zealand Prime Minister called, by last name, Palmer, and then this former president of Colombia called Álvaro Uribe, who is really not a good guy. Like Álvaro Uribe is Colombia's Fujimori, I guess. If you're Peruvian, you get that. He's a guy that has consistently um, been accused of human rights violations during his time in the presidency of being in collaboration of or just not punishing paramilitary forces in Colombia. It's really um, not someone that you would say should be involved in a human rights case, and also not someone who does not have no valid expertise in the matter. So his involvement was like, what is this guy doing here? And I only learned that he had been in that report, like I think it was someone tweeted about it today, and I was surprised because I knew about the report, but I hadn't factored in that Uribe was in there, and it makes so much sense because that report said basically, well, there's a blockade of Gaza. The blockade is legal, so Israel has a right to like do whatever it wants with the flotilla. There may have been some like um, uh, treatment that was rough around the edges, but generally it was all legal because there's a valid blockade, because Gaza is a security threat, and so you don't get to try and like break that blockade. It's not legal. Which is honestly, from my perspective and from the perspective of the fact-finding commission here on the screen, it's not really how it works. So there's a big discussion on international law on whether blockades are even legal as of this day because of the introduction of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I think it's a non-discussion really. Blockades are legal. States do still claim that they can blockade. It's in military manuals. So I think that discussion, we should just brush past it because blockades do exist. They do happen even today. The difference is that um, so after the UN Charter and especially also after the Geneva Conventions, blockades can no longer be however you want them to be. There are limitations to what you can do with use of force in international laws, particularly after the UN Charter. So traditionally speaking, a blockade consisted of you put your armada outside a port and you interdict every single ship that comes in so that you can collect the taxes if this is a financial matter, like for example um, with the what was it, the siege in Venezuela in 1904, or because you are trying to set up a siege, and so the idea is to deny food to your enemy. That kind of siege now needs to comply with the rules for the use of force, right? So whether Israel is lawfully, blockading Gaza depends on the validity to use force in international law. And so um, that's the first part. Like, can Israel actually deploy force against Palestine, against Gaza, to impose a blockade? Does it have a right to use force under international law? I would argue, no, it doesn't. Right? Because again, this whole argument of whether Israel has a right to self-defense in occupied territory, it it doesn't. Um, but even ab initio, like from the beginning, does it have a right to deploy force in Gaza? Well, why is Israel deploying force in Gaza? It's deploying force in Gaza because there was a war between it and Egypt in 1967, the Six-Day War. That's the reason why Israel's deploying force. I would argue that even that use of force against Egypt was illegal because it was a preemptive strike on Egyptian forces. Um, Others claimed that it was a legal strike because the Egyptian strike was already in formation at the time of the Israeli attack um, of the Egyptian Air Force. But let's assume, for sake of argument, I disagree with this, but let's assume, for sake of argument, that Israel has uh, had a valid reason to go to war with Egypt and therefore could deploy force against Gaza, including through a blockade. Israel and Egypt have signed a peace treaty. So after the signing of that peace treaty, what is the lawful argument that Israel can use to claim that it can continue to deploy that force that it deployed against Egypt? Not against Palestine, against Egypt. The state of Palestine has done nothing to Israel, right? So Israel's argument is, well, but Hamas. And it is highly contentious to claim that you can argue self-defense against non-state armed groups. This is something that only started happening in as of 9/11. Before that, it was pretty much accepted that you could not use armed force against non-state armed groups. And I would maintain that, yeah, that is not the case in international law right now. You cannot use armed force. You cannot claim self-defense against armed groups and invade or affect or use force in another state's territory because you claim that that state is not doing enough to contain an armed group like Hamas. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think there's a unilateral right by a state to say, I have determined that you are not doing enough to control a group, therefore I'm going to invade your territory. I don't think that has any basing in international law. It is a big discussion, sure. It's usually a small group of like global north experts who argue this, and then the rest of the world, including the non-aligned movement, which is most of the world, saying this is not allowed. So I think I would side with that and say this is not allowed. So if that is not allowed, and then there's a peace treaty with Egypt, then Israel just simply does not have the right to use force against Palestine and blockade Gaza. That use of force is illegal. And then there's, of course, the IHL component, the international humanitarian law component. Can Israel impose a blockade when the purpose of that blockade, I mean, in general, but specifically now, is to deny food to the local population as part of its ongoing genocide? And I would argue, of course, no, That is collective punishment, which is forbidden by international humanitarian law. It is disproportionate because the military advantage of the blockade is minuscule in comparison to the damage to the civilian population. And of course, it is a banned method of warfare to deprive the civilian population of food, right? So even if Israel were installing a valid blockade, it would still need to allow humanitarian aid to go in so that the civilian population does not starve. This is like, that's how it works. And so, because starvation as a weapon of war is banned, right? So, sure, blockades exist, but they are much more heavily regulated than they used to be before. And now here's the extra. This was true at the time of the Mami Marmara, and this is what this report says, this report of the fact-finding mission here on the screen. But it is now even more obvious because the International Court of Justice has already declared that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is simply unlawful because it violates the right to self-determination. So Israel has no right to be there and therefore has no right to impose any blockade. It is now patently, manifestly, obviously clear ever since that advisory opinion by the ICJ, which is why I would argue international law is still relevant even when it's not fixing the genocide, it's not ending the genocide, but it is still useful to make these kinds of arguments that this blockade is unlawful. Oh, hey, Iconoclast, I didn't see your message. And hey, Maximilian, how are you? Maximilian says it's the obligation of the occupier to allow for humanitarian aid. The blockade contradicts that obligation. Exactly. So you can institute a blockade for military means only, but if your blockade is going to starve the population, then your blockade is illegal, essentially. And so that's the setup. That's the setting, right? There is an unlawful use of force against Palestine in Gaza through the occupation, but also through the blockade and use of force in general in Gaza that is illegal and should be removed. So just on that, Israel's actions are unlawful. Now, here's where Brian Cox comes in, because like what he said here. So hold on, where is the argument that he made? So he made the argument. Oh, hey, Rosova, how are you? So he made the argument that let me find it. So he said, here are several points to consider on international law as it applies to this freedom flotilla. If Israel were genuinely engaged in a siege, it's not. Attempting to break it constitutes taking direct part in hostilities. Taking direct part in hostilities means, so usually, traditionally, yeah, I know, I know, Maximilian. But I mean, I was not going to talk about this, but since someone shared since Jartov shared the thread, then there's nothing I can do. So taking direct part in hostilities is what civilians do when they lose their protection from attack, right? So usually a civilian cannot be attacked by a belligerent. When they take direct part in hostilities, then they can. They cease to be protected as civilians. They become valid targets for as long as their participation lasts, okay? So individual civilians may not be made the object of attack. Civilians shall enjoy this protection unless and for such time as they take a direct part in hostilities, right? Okay. Humanitarian aid that is stolen by a party to a conflict to benefit that party becomes a military objective. Objects which by their purpose or use make an effective contribution to military action. It has been widely reported that Hamas steals humanitarian aid and it uses it to extort civilian population and fund its military operations. Introducing military objectives into a conflict zone can be regarded as taking direct part in hostilities. Gosh. So he even said, my God, he said that they were willing human shields. This is okay. Whew, okay, I'm not even gonna go into that. Let's just. So the presence of civilians shall not be used to render certain points immune from military operations, in particular attempts to shield military objectives from attack. As noted above, humanitarian aid that is stolen by or predictably will be stolen by, that's important, a party to the conflict for its benefit qualifies as a military objective. This is why civilians who place themselves in the flotilla for the purposes of shielding military objectives from attack may themselves be regarded as civilians taking a direct part in hostilities and therefore forfeit protection from being made the object of attack. This is bad, okay? I usually, like I would say like on 99% of the times, like I disagree with Brian Cox on international humanitarian law. But I can see sometimes where his argument comes from, right? Um, this is bonkers. So, first things first, to directly participate in hostilities, there needs to be a, a series of rules. And obviously, providing baby formula doesn't comply with them. So the first requirement for direct participation in hostilities is that there needs to be a threshold of harm. So meaning that the party to the conflict that is claiming that the civilian is participating in hostilities needs to be, let's say, damaging, doing acts contrary to the military operations of the belligerent and causing harm. Right? This harm needs to have a causal link, um, to the conduct, right? So it's a direct participation. It's not. There's no such thing as indirect participation that removes protection to civilians. So direct threshold of harm that has a belligerent nexus meaning that it is connected to the hostilities, right? So take, for example, you are in the middle of an armed conflict, there's a war going on, and then a group of gangsters rob a bank. Is there a threshold of harm to the belligerent? Yes, you are robbing a bank. Is that like damage directly the consequence of the action? Yes. I mean, the fact that they robbed the bank is what caused the damage. But does that damage have a belligerent nexus? No, the gangsters are not robbing the bank because they believe that they will be harming the war effort of the belligerent party. So can the military just show up in the bank robbery and start shooting at everyone because international humanitarian law applies? And so armed conflict rules apply? No, they cannot because there's no belligerent nexus. Now let's understand what's going on here with the flotilla and Brian Cox's analysis with those three elements in mind. Is there a threshold of harm by bringing formula and bringing like flour into an armed conflict? No, it does not harm you to feed people. It does. Unless your military operation is designed to kill civilians, giving food to civilians does not harm your military operations. Basic, right? But let's assume for a second that, okay, yes, because Hamas steals the aid, therefore there is a harm to my military operations because then Hamas will get that food and not the civilians. First of all, that is a hypothetical. Right? You don't know that food that Greta is bringing into Gaza, or that the flotilla is bringing into Gaza, will be stolen. So he even says predictably will be stolen. If it will predictably be stolen, then the connection to the harm is not direct. There's no causal link. Right? So the threshold of harm of Hamas soldiers will be fed is not the product of Greta's actions. It is the product of those who stole the food. Those who steal the aid, if they are not Hamas members, if they are regular civilians, and then give it to Hamas, those civilians will be directly participating in hostilities because they stole food from Greta to give it to Hamas. Sure. But Greta is not going to go and give the food to Hamas. So there's no direct link. And then, of course, the last one, there's no belligerent nexus. That is important. Greta is not going into Gaza to participate in the hostilities. It's like saying, is World Central Kitchen participating in the hostilities because they're operating in a war zone? No, they're not. They don't want to kill people. They want to feed people. So, so not one of the three elements is complied with. There's no belligerent nexus, there's no causal link, and then there's no threshold of harm. This is bonkers. Greta is not directly participating in hostilities, right? Um, and this lack of a belligerent nexus is important because if there's no belligerent nexus, if Greta is not really participating in hostilities, then there's a really valid argument to say that the rules of armed conflict would not apply while in the ship, right? Or dealing with Greta, right? It's not that because you walk into a war zone, all of a sudden you become, passable, subject to the laws of war. The bank robbers are operating in a war zone. That doesn't mean that the army can go and shoot them all because it's a war. It's the same with this flotilla. If Israel, attacks the flotilla, they should abide by the rules of human rights law, not the rules of international humanitarian law. They should not shoot to kill on sight, as if they were directly participating in hostilities. They should conduct this as a police operation in the high seas, if even assuming that the blockade would be legal, which it isn't, right? So they shouldn't kill anyone, right? They shouldn't use their military at all. Um, but let's assume for a second that they do harm people there, and this is a very broad concept of harm. Okay, let's assume that they do anything to the people of the flotilla that requires brute force, right? That flotilla, that specific ship, is registered to the UK. The UK is a member of the ICC. Article 12 of the Rome Statute establishes the rules for jurisdiction, including territorial jurisdiction and vessels that are subject to jurisdiction. So that ship is covered by the ICC. Whatever Israel does in that ship is covered by the ICC and could be declared, a crime against humanity, or it's interesting to think if it could be a war crime. It depends on whether you believe that Greta is engaging in. It depends on whether there's a belligerent nexus, basically. But given that they would be executing civilians, then it could be a war crime. And so and let's be clear. Affronts against honor and public humiliation are also punishable through the Rome Statute. So it's a very broad standard of harm. So yeah, whatever they do here can end up at the ICC. Okay, so this is basically my 2 cents on the on international laws applied to the flotilla.